Hi, good morning and welcome back. And this is our third week, week number three for this class on American history, church history. 뭐 시간 재고 있지? We left by the end of what the church is. We were discussing three things. Basically, I was introducing and briefing about this subject, what we are trying to discuss in this class. And first we discussed about American. It's the territory, it's the people, but it is more of the spirit. There is something called Americanism or American spirit, which is pretty much difficult. It is difficult to identify, but there is such a thing as American spirit. It's about the freedom, and it's about justice, and it is about equality, which is embedded in the American Constitution. You know what the Constitution is. That's the law of a country. Every country has a constitution, and in that constitution you do have that the ism or the ideology or the ideal value of that the nation. And for America, there are three things that they value as a nation. The reason I, try to introduce those American spirit or Americanism is those three things: the freedom, and then justice, and then equality. These are the basic, the fundamental biblical values. So we discussed that this country is identified as nation under God. That's how it began. And everyone knows the story. Everyone who's studying American history, not the church history, American history has to study the Mayflower, the ship, and then Puritans, and how they started their living in the colony of Plymouth. See, they were, the first non-militant civilian people who laid their steps on American soil is, indeed, they are refugees. And we see a lot of refugees today. That's why America is they cannot say no to the refugees, because the history begins by the refugee who's fleeing from Europe to worship, to have that freedom of worship. And then, that's how the vision of freedom to worship became the main thing for American people. So you cannot force someone to worship something or some religion. One cannot do that. But in history, there has been, and it is still going on in many countries. It is not only the religion, but it's a belief. If it's not such an organized form, it's just a belief. But usually it is a system. There are certain logics and then doctrines within that belief. Even the very so-called, indigenous belief or shamanistic belief, they do have this system. And if you are talking about political ideology such as communism, socialism, and democracy, whatever the political ideology that you are in, it is also a belief system. Fortunately, from a Christian point of view, fortunately, America choose to build their ideology, political ideology based on the biblical values and biblical teachings or biblical ideals. That's how the vision of freedom to worship, became the main thing. So one can believe whatever he or she choose to believe, and no one can force or manipulate someone else's belief. You cannot do it by power or the relationship, like a father and mother cannot force their children to believe something. That's how Americans believe. It's a little different from who came from Asian culture. We are taught, at least on my generation, we are taught that you are to just believe whatever your parents are saying, or just obey whatever they decide to do. So you are not to make a decision. Usually you don't make a decisions. Your parents they make a decisions and you obey. That's how it was. And in many Asian countries it still is. So that's very, very different ideal. They very different culture and belief. So to be an American, to become an American, it's not just having the paperwork and say you have a green card or you have citizenship. That doesn't mean that you're truly actually an American. To be an American, you have to believe in the same belief. In that sense, even if you're born in America as a white people and London language and you went to school, but there are still those who do not believe in this American spirit. They ought to believe something else. I don't want to name those, but you know who are doing those. And it's not about being a Democratic or Republican. There, still, it's not just political party. Either it's Democratic or Republican. They operate within the boundary of American spirit, within the Constitution. So Constitution lays a bigger boundary, and again, fortunately, that boundary and the biblical boundary are pretty much the same. The reason, again, as we are studying American church history, we know that American history is strongly founded on Christian belief or biblical belief. So the Americanism or American spirit and the Christian faith, the belief system kind of overlaps. They're pretty much the same. It used to be, and it's changing these days. But still, I mean, you have not changed. We have not changed the American Constitution. There is some amendments, but still. So why do we debate about the right to choose over the abortion and then gay marriage, these things? So the concern is, biblically speaking, which value is has a higher authority than the other things? So again, is it right to choose whatever the subjects are, whether it's abortion or your sexual orientation? Is that choice, right, to choose, would it be more important than labeling gay and these things, the abortion as sins? Yeah, of course, biblically they are sins, but does the Bible give higher value and authority to the value of making choice? To be a person. To be a person is a person should be able to make his or her own choice. Then be responsible, fully responsible for that choice that he or she had made. That's a very simple statement and the principle. So, I mean, there are at least, three possible options regarding the right and the responsibility. The Americanism, basically, American spirit is saying your right is your responsibility. If you have certain right, you should be responsible. A responsibility, full responsibility, 100% the same amount of responsibility follows the right, or even if you exercise your freedom, then you should be responsible for your own the freedom that you have exercised. See, the example is COVID vaccination. The country does not, at least the United States of America, they do not force their people to be vaccinated, because they believe, the Americanism says, American spirit says, you have, as a citizen, you have a freedom to choose whether to be vaccinated or not. But you have to take your own risk. You cannot blame someone while you have not vaccinated. If you get the COVID, and then that's it. You cannot blame anyone, or you cannot sue someone for getting COVID because you choose not to have the vaccination. That's how it works. But in many other countries, I don't want to name those, but you can guess and imagine that those countries, many countries, you have less right, but more responsibility. See, that's not biblical. That's not Christian. But even in a church, especially if you're Asian, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, or even Southeast Asia, not all of them, but us in those traditions, if you're the people in the lower class, you would have more responsibility and less right. See, that's how the society operated. And still, even in an Asian church, that's how it works. And that's not biblical. And they say they are church. See, this is very hypocritic as I see them. And if we are doing, Korean American church in America, then you should be pretty much American. I mean, not to be American, but has to be biblical at least. You have to be biblical. Or if you are not biblical, you cannot be biblical. At least you have to be American. And if there's something that contradicts your Korean way and then to the American belief, then it is proper to follow American belief to avoid. I mean, if you're living as a diaspora or immigrants in America, it is proper to follow the American belief system. That's what the Paul said. If you go to Rome and then you follow the Roman culture, see. And then the second topic, the colony and Anglican Church. We know the major part of America, especially those called the area called New England, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, the Maine, Virginia. These are the the areas where they settled down first, because it had a good weather, just like England. It has 4 different seasons, and they have the good soil, so it is proper. I mean, it's natural for those new immigrants to try to settle where it's most comfortable. So that's where the New Englands are. And then Louisiana and these countries, the French took over, and then later, sold to United States of America. But see, the majority of the initial colony, was formed and controlled by the United Kingdom, the England. And guess what? What is the official church for the England at the time, United Kingdom at the time? It's Anglican Church. Anglican Church is something like between Catholic and Protestant. It has a Protestant belief, but still follows some Catholic tradition. So that's how Anglican Church is. Because if you look into the history of Anglican Church, you know that how the Anglican Church was born, and it is connected closely, very closely with the state. State is church, church is state. There was more like a case in Germany, Netherlands, and the larger part of the northern Scandinavian countries. So, I mean, Switzerland, all these European countries, they did have so-called state church, with state religion. And then if you go to Latin Europe, the Italy, Spain, and the Portugal, these countries, they did have Catholics, still has a Catholic as their state church. So the church and the state was closely related, and they began to separate by so-called Reformation. Reformation by Zwingli, Calvin, Luther. These are the main characters of Reformation. And the main thing, Reformation, are two things. There is spiritual side and there is political side. And the spiritual side goes back to we want to go back to the Bible. We want to have biblical belief. And the Pope should not have authority over what we believe. That's one side. And then while they are saying the Pope does not have authority over us, they are still, at the same time, they begun to say the state should not have authority over the church. And that's the main thing. So as we study American church history, that is the major theme or the issue that sustain American church. American church believes, and then the state of America, the United States of America, they believe that church and the state are two different things. They should not mix. Actually, that idea has a positive and negative, just as state and church should identify, and we should have something called national church or national religion. I mean, once you begin to say we want to have national church or national religion, the thing that matters is where is the religious freedom? The freedom, the right. It is gone, because Bible teaches you have right to choose, even your belief. The Bible does not say you must choose to believe in God, the Yahweh, and Jesus Christ. That's not how it says. You have right to choose, but you are to have that consequences. You should be responsible for your choice. And God is saying you are a sinner. Every human being that born on earth at this time are sinners. They born as a sinners. And I'm offering you the second chance to be able to, because God's saying I'm going to forget about the past, and that forget about the fact that you're born with the sin and into the sinful world. But you have right and the freedom to choose again. This is a second chance. You can either choose me or choose to stay as who you are, the sinner. And that's how that's what the gospel is. So when you say that, going back to that, when you say the church is the state and state is the church, then that freedom, the right to choose, will be gone. Once that's gone, it becomes unbiblical. It's not biblical. Because Bible teaches you to be able to choose. You are as a free person. See, that's what the issue is. And if you understand that issue, then you pretty much understood the main, the backbone of American church history. Again, so when you are in colony, the English people comes in and they tries to tell you what to believe again. So the Anglican Church tried to have influence over this new territory, New England, in America. There are like 13 states at the when they revolt revolted against the England, and that's called the Revolutionary War. And they win over that, and they become a free state. That's where the 4th of July we just celebrated. See, so when you ask a question, what's wrong with the colony and having the Anglican Church on colonial territory? Yeah, the issue is your nation under God, fine. That does not mean that the state's gonna force you to believe in God. See, that's two different stories. So try to understand the nation under God as the general statement, the country of America, the United States of America, it has been established or founded on that biblical ideal, not Christian religion or the church. See, that's very different thing. So nation under God actually is very biblical statement. But it's not, the America nation is not church. See, that's two different things. Now, 21st century America. See, all these things comes to who we are and what are we going to do. See, church and a nation and a state. Are we that separated? Are we still keeping that right and responsibility? See, when it comes to like abortion, gay rights, and all, LGBTQ, all these things, see, the state is trying to say the things about these moral issues and trying to make it as a law. But I believe that personally, state can say you should not discriminate anyone, for that matter, anyone, based on their race, then gender, age. See, then sexual orientation, fine. You should include those in the statement, because you should not discriminate someone based on those things, which would not go against or go for a human dignity. Many Christians believe being being a gay, homosexual, or transgender, whatever, that diminish the human dignity. Still, it is their personal decision, right to choose, and it's their freedom to choose. And as a Christian, you should protect their right to choose, even though they're choosing to become evil. See, that's what the Adam and Eve had made their choice. When they made their choice, they exercised their freedom and their right, and then they become responsible. That's what the basic core Bible ideal is. A person, a personal being. When we say a human dignity, that means he or she should be able to make his or her own choice, making that as deep freedom, and also become responsible. But when the state comes in and says, you cannot say that gay and abortion is both are sin. State cannot say that. That's where the argument is. And in a church, a pastor should be able to say whatever he or she feels right according to his or her own belief. That's what the church is for. And if state comes in and say you cannot say that in a church or even in a public, I mean you should be able to say those things, because the America, it says you have freedom of speech as long as it doesn't go against the public well-being, the benefit of the many. And the argument from their side is it's hurting us, the LGBTQ community. See, I mean, if we try to make that argument can go to any kind of issues. See, that's not a good argument. So what's the general public? General public is just general public which does not have any inclination or any inclination or any particular preference. Excuse me. Miscellaneous. As we are discussing the church, we're still on the church. We are not going to history yet. The church is a fellowship of believers, and it is a very peculiar and particular group of people. It can be virtual. It can be actual community. Virtual, not like electronic virtual, but when we say virtual, it means it's invisible, but it exists. So it's a virtual fellowship. We are bound by the Holy Spirit. That's what the church is. So it's a virtual fellowship, but still you have so-called actual community in a local congregation, local church. And you see the people, the believers, you come and you shake hands and hug and say hello, and then worship together, eat together, and listen to the sermons and do all these things, Bible studies. And these are actual community. So the church can be actual community. And when we are talking about American church history, we are speaking of both the virtual fellowship beyond the time and space, and then there are actual communities on a local base gathering together as a local church. having the names and the place to come together and the membership and so on. Then we have something called cults and all these things. Okay, why don't we take a break and then let me come back, okay? All right, I'm back. So when we discuss the topic of church, there are like these cults and the sects and pseudo-Christianity, which looks like church, but which is not. And see, those are also as a part of history, even though as Christians do not like those things. It's as part of it, and we'll try to discuss that and what the effects are. And there are some other names. Okay. Let's go on to doing a history, chapter 3. Part 1, chapter 3 is about history. Because we are doing a history. And it's a church history, it's American history, American church history. And what is a history and how do we do it? The main thing about this class and the previous class that we had about the early church history are the same thing. It is more of, you can find those list of events and then well described list, the explanation of what had happened and who's are there. Those you can just go into the books and read about them. But the thing is, major thing is, why do we study history and how do we do it? Because every historian has different ideas about history. And it is important for you to build your own perspective or interpretation of history. I cannot force you to have that, or I can suggest, but I cannot, make you to believe in certain things, just like we discussed. So these classes on history are not just, classes to present you with the mere facts. If I do that, I'm not a good teacher. I'm not a good professor. I believe rather than throwing these mere facts of the records, we just regurgitate or repeat the records of the past. It is more important to be able to reflect on it and to imply on it, and then build your own perspective on how you read history. So that's the chapter 3 is about. Here's a kind of dictionary definition about history. Merriam-Webster, one of the best known and good English dictionary, and says a chronological record. Chronological means by the progress of time. Chrono means time, right? Chronological, past to present, in a given order, by year, by month, by date. So chronological record of significant events. See, it's a significant event. The question is, how do you determine the significance? How do you determine? And who's going to determine? See, already, when you do that, even before the writing the record, you are editing the narrative. Because you cannot write everything, or you cannot videotape everything. That's not possible. Even if you videotape the certain things, depending on the angle and the size of the video clip, you will have very different interpretation and perspective. For example, these days we have something called if you are familiar with any sports events, sports games such as soccer and baseball, we have something called video assisted referee. That's what the VAR stands for. Meaning, you're making a decision. Looking at those videos, and with the multiple camera angles and recordings, still you are not able to make 100% exact, proper, accurate decision on these things, even with the multiple cameras. See, that shows how it is difficult to make that judgment significant. So the history, writing history, it's all about judgment, the decisions. And it depends on who's making that judgment and who's writing the material and who makes the choice to write or not to write. And even if you make a choice to write about the same thing, same subject, say this is significant. For example, let's talk about the assassination of the President Kennedy. See, everyone believes, not everyone, most historians agree that it is a very critical and important event in American history. But how you write it, that's different from A to B, Republican to Democrat. And not only that, it is different from how you view in America to how you view in some other countries. So every history is debatable, meaning you can argue about the written history, even if you agree that's important. Same thing with the American church history. As I find it, as I read it, most of the books written about American church history in general, they do exclude the story of Native American, so-called American Indians. It's only a small portion. They do not give significance to how the church, American church, dealt with Native American issues. They killed millions and millions of Native American, directly, with the guns and knives, sword, but also indirectly through making them hungry and getting them sick with the European disease. All these things, from Native Indians' perspective, it's a huge thing. It's very significant story. And they try to convert these American Indians, native people, into Catholic, into Protestant baptism and Baptist and all these things. They do write about how the white people went to American Indians or the native people to evangelize them. So-called American Indian mission. That's their perspective, the white church. But there's a very little about, even still, they write just a little about them. Same thing with the black church. If you read the American church history, most general books written by white Christians, evangelical Christians, white Christians, they write these history books. There's only little about black American church history. For them, it is not so significant. See, these are those imbalance. And we, as American, whether you're Asian descent or African descent or Hispanic descent, no matter what, we should try to be able to, balance these significance. So that means we need to go back and rewrite some of this American church history. See, the reason that I'm teaching this class, I think, is to help us to review already written American church history from the white Protestant Anglo-Saxon perspective to general, overall, inclusive and balanced, having the balanced significance. So again, going back to the history, significant events such as those affecting a nation or institution, often including an explanation of their causes. Yeah, not only the causes, but effects as well. So cause and effects and implications and so on. And in that sense, there's nothing that is neutral about doing history or writing the history. There is no such a thing as objectivity in doing history. Other science, chemistry, physics, mathematics, those are the science that has certain degree of objectivity. But when it comes to history, sociology, and literature, these things, that's why they call it liberal arts, including theology. These liberal arts are liberal. It doesn't provide you with objectivity. There is no such thing as objectivity in doing these science. You can write the facts, but facts alone does not make history. History always accompanies and it brings interpretation. So it's an art of interpretation, and we're trying to represent the history that the past to our generation or to the coming future generation how we should perceive these things that happened in the past. So the thing is, people who wrote the history at the time in the past, he or she writes from their present. This is where I write the history in 17th century. But when it comes to 21st century right here, we are reading those writings that were written in 17th century perspective. And we are doing, again, trying to say, what are the significance for us today? So that's what the history is. There is certain gaps. And their perspective in the 17th century would be much different from what we have on today, 21st century. So how do we make up that gap? We cannot go back and try to have that 17th century perspective. That's not possible. I mean, you can try to a certain degree, but you will be never the same, exactly the same as who he or she writes that narrative and the history at their time. The only thing that you can exactly, accurately match is the time and place. Beyond that, who did what, that would be open to interpretation. That's the art of the history. That's the magic of history. That's why history is so fun. And you have to be somehow creative in doing history. So you come back to the 21st century, and then it's the year 2021, and we read these things happened in the past, and it should include explanation of their causes, and even doing that explanation of the causes and the effects, there will be very different opinions. See, that's the history. You cannot have the same idea. And not only you cannot, but you should have very different ideas about the cause and the effects. You don't have to agree. See? If someone says history should be understood in a certain way. Yeah, I'm sorry to say this, but if you came from some of the Asian countries, including mine, we are taught. This is how you do the history. That's how you interpret the history. And you're tested, choose out of 4 different suggestions, and they say this only one. This one is the right answer. There's no right answer in history, and then we are taught to memorize the dates and the events, and we're not taught to do the open interpretation of history. That's how we were educated and actually brainwashed and manipulated politically, socially, culturally. See, we have to acknowledge that many of us Asians, especially in those so-called more strict countries, were educated in their way and brainwashed. And it is very difficult for us who are accustomed to that kind of education. no, it is very difficult for us to think otherwise. For myself, I was fortunate enough to go abroad to other countries when I was young, teenager, and go into this American school for the missionaries, and then I was re-educated. I kind of knew that, understood, I was brainwashed. And when you do education in a free country such as America, your thoughts and your perspective does change. It does change. And do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. To change your perspective. I mean, you have freedom and the right to make that decision. And many of us Asian countries, you are not so free, or they do not emphasize your right. We are taught to emphasize responsibility, the duty, and the love for country. It's not the loyalty to the country. I mean, actually you're being loyal to certain ideology, and you're being taught to be loyal to certain person. For us Korean, who in my generation, we were raised to, know only one president, President Park. And see, even elementary school, they had the textbook and saying the president of the Republic of Korea is Park Chung-hee. See, that was in the textbook. They don't do it no more. It can change from every 4 years, every 5 years from now. But at the time, he did like 3 different terms. And he was president for many years before he was assassinated. And many the Asian countries still, there is certain dominant ideology preventing their people not to exercise their right or freedom. They say it is luxury. We need to be developed economically. That's how they manipulated us in Korea. So you need to sacrifice your right and freedom to be able to live more, to have better quality of life. What's the better quality of life if you do not have freedom and the right? If you cannot exercise your right, that it has no quality at all. But somehow we were trained and educated to believe, we need to live better, meaning money-wise, and better condition, while sacrificing the right and freedom. And this is still going on in many countries, not just in Asian countries, Middle East, African countries, and many South American countries. Still, that is ideology. You should sacrifice your personal things, personal right, for the nation. For the nation. So what is a nation? For them, the nation is the ruling party, or the ruler, whether it's a president or secretary of the state or whatever. Okay. So we need to do a better history. If we are not able to do the good history, we still need to do a better history, according to this. And also Merriam-Webster says the history is a branch of knowledge. It's a science that records and explains past events. So that's another definition of history. Pretty much is similar to the first one, but says it records and then it explains past events and people. Events and people. Here's another one. Oxford says the study of past events, particularly in human affairs. Particularly in human affairs. I mean, when we deal with the history, we deal with the ecology, the animals and plants, and geography, and then climate, and these things are included. But most likely it has to do with the human affairs. And for American Church, it's American Church affairs of particularly with the in American Church affairs. The whole second definition says the whole series of past events connected with someone or something. Here is the connection. Being connected is the key word here. That means history is any events in history does not stand alone by itself. Same for today. Whatever happens, it does have that connection, whether it's personal, whether it's cultural, whether it's political. It does have connection to you. See, the president election in America, 2020 election, it does have implication for you, every individual. Some of you are the foreign students studying, came from other countries. And who becomes the president may affect your visa status. See, recently they removed the limitation of stay for the students. As long as you're studying, you can just stay in America. But President Trump tried to limit that to 2 years, 3 years. But that attempt has gone. So now you are free to stay as long as you remain as a student. If you take a full-time study, that you are okay to stay in America. See, these things, because Biden became a president, it does affect you personally. So that means connected. The thing is, how the past events are going to affect you who you are today. It does affect in many areas with a deep level of degree. So who you are isn't just who you are. It is you because of the past. And in that sense, that past determines much of who you are. So why do we do the American church history? If we are attending one of the churches in America, whether it's a Korean American church, Chinese American church, or Filipino American church, and any other white church, black church, doesn't matter. These churches are the are connected to all these events in the history. And our job as a historian is to see how these events have affected our church today and me as a Christian today. And you are trying to find that connection. And here's a scholastic definition. The historians, so-called historians are making this. The bodies of knowledge about the past produced by historians, together with everything that is involved in the production, communication of, and teaching about that knowledge. So history is that is about the body of knowledge that is written by historians in the past, and then how that was delivered and then taught. So the history includes not the history itself, but doing of history is also included. Another scholastic definition says the attempt made by professional historians to record and reconstruct the past through the study of evidence derived from a variety of sources. Because we cannot go back, using the time machine. If we have such a thing as time machine, the history will be much easier. But we only have the fragments of the records. For example, the Mayflower. We don't exactly know how that ship looked like, and how they started the journey and what happened during the journey. There's only fragmentation of records. They did not record everything. That's not even possible, not even today. With all this technology, it is impossible to record everything. So there's only fragmentation. But we use those resources, a variety of sources. There are books, pictures, and then narratives, even the myth. All these things are used as evidence. The thing is, who's going to determine whether this evidence is valid or not? So the validity of evidences are key to doing good science of history. So in that sense, because the history it's not your imagination, or it's not your guess, or you're gonna make up the story. That's not going to be history. That's just art of literature if you do that. For the history, you use evidences. Because if we use evidences and make good educated guesses, it is science. In that sense, it is science. So by this definition, a history is a science, and it is a very good science. So now the question is it history science or art? We'll talk about that soon. Here's E.H. Carr, one of famous historian, says in his book, What is history? Yeah, he writes this. History is a continuous process of interacting between the historians and his facts. An unending dialogue between the present and the past. See, it's unending, ever going on. There is no end or no conclusion. Once if you are able to conclude a certain events in the history and its significance, and then that's so it's such as a dialogue between the present and past. We live in the present, and there's someone in the past written about it. It's at 17th century, they wrote about it, and the 16th century, they wrote about how the church started, how the Puritans came in, and us in the 21st century is trying to dialogue with those events that we know. And the only fragments of the record, but we try our best to reconstruct what had happened, and then try to interact with it. So we deal with the facts, but facts alone does not make a history. We try to elaborate on those history. So that would be the word. Elaborate includes interpretation, guessing, and trying to make scientific archaeology. All these things are included in the elaborate. So that's how we do the history. I think time's up for this week, and thank you for coming and listening, and hopefully I'll see you next week, continuing on the subject of trying to get to know what the history is about as we do the American church history. Thank you and goodbye. Take care.